private landowners. And I'm presenting on reserve forest land. Gave a presentation earlier this year on reserve forest land to this committee, focused mostly on how it came to be and the real details of the administration of the program, following testimony from a couple of weeks ago related to H596, following up kind of a zoomed out version of that presentation, considering how it relates to other goals, and so on, and maybe opening up for some discussion related to some of that. So for context, several years ago, a draft bill came forward that was proposing that a new enrollment category, sub-enrollment category of forest land get created, and land would be eligible for passive management if that land was permanently conserved as forever wild. And at that time, it was there were some concerns we had with the bill related to who might be eligible, the concerns that passive management, while an appropriate strategy in some contexts, may be a barrier to achieving forest resilience and other goals. And because of the cost of conservation easements, that there may be some really limited access by landowners to enrollment in the category. And there were some challenges we foresaw in how to balance goals for wild forests with other goals for active management and things like that. And at the core of the proposal, we understood that old forests was really the intent, the values that come from old forests. And historically, in use value appraisal, all family-owned forests needed to be managed in part for saw timber, with some options for ecologically significant treatment areas, but no parcel could be managed primarily for old forest. Every parcel had to have some management for saw timber. And I'll jump back into that in a little bit and how reserve forest land addressed that. But for context, I think this is important for and use value appraisals. Folks know there's two main enrollment categories: forest land and agricultural land. And forest land that's enrolled is subject to the commissioner's minimum management standards. A management plan gets developed upon enrollment. Landowners need to adhere to that management, implement the activities that are prescribed in it, and not implement activities that are not prescribed in it. Within any of the subcategories within forest land, the land needs to be managed for the purposes of that subcategory. So in productive forest land, the broad category that almost all land is enrolled in, it needs to be managed for saw timber. There are other enrollment subcategories like the ecologically significant treatment areas. Somebody can enroll riparian areas in this category, and in a certain distance from a stream or surface water, that land can be managed for the riparian functions instead of or in addition to saw timber. But there's a very limited eligibility to that. Yeah.
So how do sugar bushes work? So this is the theme of the morning.
Great. So sugar bushes we're actually considering creating them as an enrollment subcategory within forest land. But right now, sugar bush can either be enrolled in the forest land, productive forest land category, or in the agricultural land category. If it's enrolled in the agricultural land category, then property valuation review administers that. They benefit from the agricultural use value rate, but there's no management plan, et cetera. If they enroll on the forest land side of it, there are some specific management criteria and plan criteria that accommodate management of that land as a sugar bush. And so the management objective there is for SAP, as well as other forest land goals. So that's how that fits in. So as folks know, there's a lien mechanism. When land is enrolled, land needs to adhere to the management plan, can't be developed. And when management activity is conducted, there is a forest management activity report that's required every time that activity is implemented. So going back to the old forests, parts of it. Old forest is not simply unmanaged forest land. Old forest land is a condition of forest that confers certain values like nature, native biodiversity, wildlife habitat, hydrologic regulation, carbon storage, forest resilience. And these functions, these values are the result of the conditions of old forest and the characteristics of old forest. And those characteristics take time to develop or can be supported in their development actively. And these characteristics include large old trees, spatial variability in tree density, abundant downwood, multiple canopy layers, large standing dead trees, regeneration, and at times unique plant communities. It's really important to stress that these values, these conditions are not exclusive to old forest. They can be supported by degrees and with active management. But the values and the characteristics can be unique to old forests. And so they've got value in that respect. And coupled with other management objectives, it's worth supporting their presence on the landscape in balance with other management goals and conditions.
Keith, just to pause here, in old forest, and you may have started by answering this question and I missed it, but is it simply related to age, or is an old forest just a forest that was not a forest 100 years ago and now is a forest?
That's a great question, and it's one that a lot of folks are wrestling with, including the Forest Service and others. There's old growth forest. Imagine forest that's never been harvested, never been touched. There's virtually none, less than 1% in Vermont of that condition. But what that is, how it expresses, is that is the natural expression of that forest. It's got these characteristics and therefore it has these values. Much of our landscape is reverting from agriculture, and you may have old trees. They may be 100 years old, they may be 120 years old or more, but the forest is not expressing as an old forest. It is, we often call them teenage years, that it doesn't have large trees, it doesn't have regeneration, it doesn't have the structural characteristics or the diversity of tree species that confer all these values. And so in many respects, old forest, it's very easy to say, well, it's 150, it's just this bright line. And that would be a very simple way to communicate it. Unfortunately, the age itself doesn't confer the value. It's the condition. And there's a slide in here that actually helps to distinguish between how one forest of one age may actually have more ecological function at a younger age than an older forest of the same age through active management. Or it could be disturbance processes or things like that.
And old forest is not synonymous with old growth forest, is that?
That's true. And it gets into semantics a little bit. I think in the forestry community, I think there's a really special place for old growth forests, a place that really has not had human disturbance, but we can't remake old growth forests. We can't, once it's been plowed under, once it's been cleared, you can't bring back 10,000 years of history and replace that. But what we can do is support our forests to have characteristics of old growth forests, whether it be through passive management or active management. So this gets to some of that. So old forest is absent in Vermont as a functional component of the landscape. Because of our land use history, there is just very little forest that actually has these structural characteristics. Vermont Conservation Design sets a target of about 9% or 419,000 acres of Vermont's forest land to be in an old forest condition. And as I described in the previous slide, old forests have real values. It's estimated that about 218,000 acres of our forests are in an ownership or in a conservation condition that they will develop into old forest with time. So in state lands or a permanent protection that prevents development or certain kinds of management, over time they'll be allowed to develop to that condition. I'll speak a little bit more to this, but one of the patterns we've seen is that these old forest targets get stressed very effectively. They're really important targets. And I haven't even mentioned carbon or flooding or et cetera. They get advocated for very strongly by some. I think what's important to consider every time somebody's bringing up certain targets is that there are other targets that those goals may be in tension with. And so while old forest targets is one, Vermont Conservation Design also has a young forest target for 3 to 5% of the landscape being in a young forest condition, and you cannot manage for young forest and old forest on the same acre. And so and we don't get our biodiversity goals or some other goals while maximizing old forest but ignoring young forest. We need both. So it's a yes and yes, which creates this balancing act that we need to navigate. And that's really where we got to with reserve forest land, is trying to consider that balancing act. Yes.
Just for context, I should be able to do the math, but how many acres of forest in all of Vermont? 5 million?
About 4.5 million acres of forest land in Vermont, 3.5 million are private land. And so VCD, Vermont Conservation Design, has its own ecological targets, and it's important to consider those when we're thinking about biodiversity, ecological function. In addition to those ecological targets are other economic, cultural, social targets and objectives that we have in the state that are also extremely important, and you know very well. Forest Future Strategic Roadmap is an example. And so in some cases, the conditions themselves can be in conflict. You can't have young forest and old forest on the exact same acre. But you might get to old forest in a variety of ways, active management or passive management. And they both have the complementary ecological outcomes. But if you do active management, you may support economic goals as well as the ecological goals. And it's not to say one is better than the other, but we need all the strategies on the table. So I think it's important, as we're considering all this, that the concepts of old forest, young forest, economic potential, the concepts are absolutely compatible. But the strategies or the approaches that we meet our respective goals may not be, or they may be optimized in different ways. And so that's just important as we hear proponents advocating for certain goals, to just trying to see how they can be best balanced with other important goals. So when responding to the proposal for UVA to allow for wild forest, we brought it back to old forest as a priority, as opposed to wild forest, to really be as inclusive as possible, really looking for these outcomes to advance this old forest target. And the first objective of considering reserve forest land was that the primary purpose and outcome of forest land in UVA is to keep forest land in productive use with oversight by licensed professionals. The second objective is to increase opportunities to achieve old forests on UVA and old forest land at a scale and pattern that helps Vermont benefit from old forest values. The challenge faced in UVA is that no parcel could be managed for old forest. And every parcel had to have some management for saw timber, and the old forest targets really need large areas to be allowed to or supported in movement towards old forest. And so it needs to be possible in UVA at a scale greater than the individual parcel. And that wasn't possible.
Representative Cole.
I have a question, might be a little controversial, but I am curious about your take on this. And it's, I think 2 slides ago, you were talking about how, active forest management can have this balance, which is great, between forest health and economic benefit. And I'm curious when, with these, like McNeil, for example, with wood burning plants to fuel larger facilities, and in the Northeast Kingdom, I forget how much percentage that facility provides to our state's electricity, but it's a lot. And I'm curious about, since there could be forest health benefits to taking some of that wood there, I'm curious, how do we measure and know when that line is crossed to meet the demand of those wood burning needs? Versus like how, is that something, like, how can we keep an eye on that, just and make a judgment call because there's the economic need versus the forest need, and making sure that one voice is not overriding the other, and being very thoughtful about that.
I think it's a perfect question. And I am gonna totally fail in my answer on it. To even being paying attention to what is the balance?
Yeah.
What would it look like? I think requires a lot of people coming in and trying to answer that question.
Yeah.
And there will be really good perspectives. Every one of us has a narrow view. And that's why I think multiple people coming in and asking that question. I know that there has been some work in the past about what's Vermont's breadbasket and so on. So I think some of this work has been done. Perhaps not as it relates to forest resilience, but maybe more broadly is this what's sustainable harvesting measures and so on, what's available. And so I would defer to other programs in our department and to answer that question best.
So FPR as a whole doesn't have like a necessarily like a number or take or data, but rather like you pull information from other stakeholders to try to find that.
I think I'll defer to Danny.
Danielle Fitzgerald, Commissioner for Parks and Recreation. I think we could look at forest inventory analysis data that the U.S. Forest Service does. There is a growth to removal sort of ratio, and we're actually growing 3 times more than removing.
Mm-hmm.
Removing also includes mortality or land conversion. So we certainly, with the Forest Service, help track that. Also have forest condition sort of ratings. One of the main goals of the Forest Strategic Roadmap is to sort of have a more transparent sort of tracking of how we're doing. There is actually a tool developed from the Forest Ecosystem Monitoring Cooperative that looks at regeneration, that looks at growth, that looks at health. It sort of has a grade associated with it that we want to bring more forward so people can see that, you know, many places we're doing really well. In some cases, like maybe it's deer growls where we've got to watch out for if it's impacting regeneration. It's pretty complex, but there is a lot of good work that's already done that I think we can bring more forward out.
And maybe one last follow-up on that one too. So obviously you all have done a lot of amazing research on forest health in so many different ways. And you know, these wood burning plants have different interests, which is to heat or to electrify whatever facility they, and so the communication between you two seems so very critical, so that, you know, they're not just taking from whatever place, like they want to be sure that they're getting from, or we want to be sure that they are getting from where they should be getting from, that aligns with ecological health. So yeah, so I'm curious about like the history of communication and like how those sales and those purchases in mass quantity for wood chip style.
I will share that for both McNeil and Rygate, we have MOUs in place that have harvesting guidelines.
Awesome.
We just actually have been working with Rygate to update theirs, to modernize it, which includes greater focus on regeneration and some other factors like invasive plants. So we've taken a look and worked with them. In addition, all harvests that go to a biomass facility like Rygate or McNeil are reviewed by fish and wildlife biologists, which will take a look particularly for like impacts on habitat, but also looked at wetlands. And so there is another layer of review that those harvests actually get, looking at the impacts on the ground. So there's a lot, there is oversight.
Good, thank you.
I don't know if there's more you want to add to.
Well, I guess I'd add that the structure of use value appraisal, a lot of the work that we do at foresters, in some cases, there's regulatory mechanisms that manage the impacts of harvesting activity. In other cases, there are incentive programs, whether it be through NRCS or use value appraisal program, not quite an incentive program, but a program nevertheless that supports active management that has certain sidebars on how wood is produced and harvested that ensures that wherever it's going, whether it's going to an energy generation plant or for saw timber or other uses, that it is done in a scientifically sound way. And I think it's really valuable for us to be ensuring that the forest products have, we minimize the negative impacts. I think what we also need to be considering is how critical and how valuable the benefits can be of the thoughtful management. In many cases, the generation of energy or the production of forest products isn't just compatible, but is necessary for restoration and supporting forest resilience. So the ability to sell those products actually enables the restoration and the opportunities for us to have healthier forests. So it's not just a matter of minimizing the harm, but optimizing the benefits. So following the discussion of,
Did you want to ask?
Yeah. It's a little anecdotal, but it's to add to the confidence of interrogator, Representative Hall. Having been managing this winter a parcel, if a portion of that harvest is going to McNeil. There were 3 foresters involved with the landowner, their forester, county forester, McNeil forester. I had never had a more interesting and educational involvement for that landowner to be able to get value, forget the economic value, to get the value of getting a lot of this unmarketable material in any other form to market was extremely important. The most rigorous forester of all was McNeil forester, about different conditions, what time it could be accessed, the ecological. Don't cut these little saplings here. I mean, it was a collaboration that was very exciting. And I don't do chipwood generally, almost ever. So it was educational, and I was very impressed with their rigorous enrollment into their program, just on a small, 30, 40 acre parcel. Sorry for the anecdote.
so after a lot of back and forth, a lot of testimony and discussion in the legislature, Act 146 was passed, and it created the reserve forest land category. It began on, it required that a report was developed by FPR, establishing the standards for the program. And the enrollments in the subcategory began on July 1 of last year. This past April 1, just a couple of weeks ago, was the first deadline for plan updates since the start of the new category. So as a reminder, forest management plans need to be updated every 10 years. And April 1st is the deadline for those plan updates. So by April 1, every single year, we get about 10% of the forest land enrollment management plans are submitted to our county foresters. So it's roughly 1,600 management plans get submitted to our county foresters. So they're buried under a pile of management plans right now that they're reviewing. At this point, we aren't clear what the adoption rate from this update cycle is, because there are some specific plan requirements and management standards. There will be many landowners who are interested in this, who know that they have a plan update due in the near future, and are going to wait until that update to take advantage of the enrollment opportunity, because they don't need to spend money on a plan prematurely. They might as well do it at the same cycle if it's not creating a conflict with implementation of their existing plan. I will give some updates on what our total numbers and acres are to date. So as I mentioned, the reserve forest land subcategory is forested land. It's managed with a primary purpose of accrual and protection of old forest functions and values. Management can include active or passive management, inclusive of the range of silvicultural strategies, when it's consistent with all other standards. And this was a big point. There will be instances, if somebody's enrolled in reserve forest land, that something as significant as a clear cut may in fact be appropriate for advancement of old forest conditions. Imagine a monoculture of non-native species in a forest, one species, and old forest is a diversity of species with a diversity of age classes and so on. It might be that really starting over in that place, leaving some of the dead wood on the ground, can bring you towards the diversity and structural conditions faster than doing nothing might. Or at least it's a reasonable option.
Senator O'Brien.
Can open land be enrolled in current use as forest land?
This is a weird paradox. Forest land has subcategories, as I mentioned. The rules back in 1984 established that 20% of a parcel may be enrolled as open land. And though it's not agricultural land. And so with that, over time, the evolution has been that forest land is the overarching category. Within forest land, there may be open land enrolled, but there is a cap on what percentage of the total acres can be enrolled.
But you could manage it for, like you were just saying about new forests, like essentially you aspire that this is gonna be a first generation forest, right? Just for habitat, for example.
Sure.
For birds. So
Yeah.
it's like,
And folks will they'll enroll open land and allow it to revert in some cases if they've got open land that's exceeding the maximum threshold. They'll be allowed to plant it, and then once it's planted, it can become eligible even though it's extremely young. So going back to the balancing act I was talking about, one of the major mechanisms we use to support the balance, and the way we were thinking about it is if there are 2 million acres of forest enrolled and 16,000 parcels, the goal is to allow some portion of these to be eligible to be managed for old forest. But if we allow for all of them, not knowing what the adoption or uptake rate will be, then we risk abandoning that balance. And so at the time, we were considering what if, and recognizing also importantly that there's a trade-off, more so in some acres than others, between if I'm managing for old forest and I'm using active passive management, where I won't be managing for saw timber, but we have a saw timber management objective, the economic objective. If an acre is able to be managed for saw timber and it goes into old forest for passive management, that may be a totally valid goal, but we have a real trade-off. And one of our goals was to consider, do we have parcels? Do we have acres where the parcel may be less of a trade-off or more appropriate to manage for its ecological values than others? And admittedly, there's no precise line that anybody can draw that makes one a perfect, this is valuable for saw timber, or this is valuable for old forest. They all have potential for both. Our approach was to identify parcels that had a disproportionate element of their forest was ecologically significant, like wetlands, riparian areas, endangered species habitat, existing old forest already, things like that, or sensitive conditions like really steep slopes where pushing somebody to manage on that when there's already some risks, and it may be able to be appropriately done, but it really creates some pressures for somebody if they're obligated to manage in those conditions, that those parcels that achieved a certain threshold of acres might be eligible for this enrollment category. And so the way we did it is that a parcel with greater than 100 acres or more, if 30% of that parcel is composed of significant and sensitive conditions, then the entire parcel, all acres, in addition to those acres that are not significant or sensitive, could be eligible to be managed for reserve forest land. In parcels less than 100 acres, the threshold is 50%. And I'll come back to why there's a difference between those two thresholds. The significant sensitive conditions, as I mentioned, ecologically significant treatment areas, there's some pre-existing conditions in the program related to that. Steep slopes greater than 35%, site forelands, think wetlands or mountaintops, really not able to produce trees. And special places in sensitive sites, think cemeteries or indigenous heritage sites or things like that. In aggregate, if those conditions add up to more than 30 or 50% respectively, then the entire parcel may be eligible. So what this looks like, on a parcel less than 100 acres, the threshold is at 50%. So this parcel on the top has got 85 enrolled acres, and 53 of those are significant for sensitive conditions. In this case, it's all steep slope. But on this map, both the light blue and the tan are, the light blue is riparian areas, the tan is steep slope. And so in this case, 62% of the parcel is significant and sensitive conditions. The top parcel is eligible. The parcel on the bottom has both riparian areas and steep slopes, but only 33% of it is significant and sensitive conditions. The bottom example is not eligible. Going to 100 acres or greater, we're looking at 30% eligibility threshold. In the top example, we've got 365 enrolled acres, and 162 are riparian and steep slope. And so the top example is eligible, while the bottom example only has 10% significant sensitive conditions. It's not eligible. And I think at least in these examples, the logic bears out. Looking at the top example, there are some real operational barriers to managing that property for saw timber. Whereas the bottom example, there are far fewer barriers. And so the trade-offs between old forest goals and productive forest management in the top example, while there are trade-offs, absolutely, they're less than they would be on the example on the bottom. In terms of management and the management plans have old forest specific management requirements. And so you can imagine, as I was describing those characteristics that old forests have to confer those values. In the management planning process, we do evaluate, is this forest providing those values, and does the management support development or accrual of those values and those characteristics? And so there are additional requirements about measuring core suite material, assessing deer browse, ensuring that the AMPs are implemented. In some cases, like monoculture plantations, there may be active management required, so that there's a jump start for development of those old forest characteristics. We do stress to folks, this is not a do nothing enrollment category. This is not about passive management. This is about old forests. And what we've seen so far from our enrollments is that folks are taking that seriously, and folks are doing a really good job incorporating active management to advance old forest values and functions that both generate revenue and advance these characteristics. Enrollment in this category is voluntary. It may be some or all of the parcel. Once the parcel has met the threshold, all of it may be enrolled. But somebody may say, I only want to enroll these 60 acres in reserve forest land, and these 60 is productive forest. That option is being taken advantage of with the few submissions we've had. And landowners may transition between enrollment categories. So somebody may, and this is true today, if somebody's enrolling as productive, of the 2 million, most are enrolled as productive forest land right now. There's been a lot of investment by the state in supporting that management for saw timber. But we're creating this new category, and folks may transition over to this reserve forest land category. But the same will be true in the future. There may be landowners who say, you know what, active management for saw timber is really what I'm interested in, or my whole forest blew down. And while that may be perfect for old forests, that's not perfect for me. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to clean that up, recoup the value, and they may revert it to productive forest land. And when they do, it'll be subject to all of the productive forest land standards. And our thinking is we want folks to have the flexibility. We want to support both goals. And there's going to be a learning process as people figure out what the right fit is for them and for our landscape.
Representative O'Brien?
Thinking of UVA, or current use, it's sort of tax policy is informing forest goals, right? So I just wondered how much at FBR, thinking of state forests and state parks, your thinking sort of aligns with those same values in current use, like the U manager forest, thinking of them as working lands, and this is an active management parcel, and this is more of an ESTA already, you know, like were you doing this 20 years ahead of where we are now?
No. No, I mean, I'm learning with everybody else. I was thinking on my way up here, I was studying forestry. When I was in college, I was advocating for expansion of wilderness areas on Forest Service lands. As I learned more and was consulting, I at times struggled when I was marking trees to be cut because I thought that they were too cool to be cut. And then I realized that I couldn't do what needed to be done or what was appropriate unless I was willing to support harvesting of these and figuring out what the operational realities were and all of that. So all of us are finding out how to strike this balance, and it's a really good conversation. I think that every one of us needs to come to it with humility because there are really important considerations that are worth considering that aren't front of mind for us. And every choice we make on when we do management has lasting impacts, and it has trade-offs. It is really important to figure out what's the right practice, the right place, and what the right balance is. And there's not a singular right answer, but there are a lot of right answers. And I think that's one of the beauties of kind of creating opportunities like this enrollment category with sideboards. But there are trade-offs with that. And I'll get to, there are frustrated landowners as a result of some of the sideboards that we create for this. And this is kind of leading into that, stressing that there are both active and passive management opportunities to manage our lands. It's not binary either. It's a gradient of opportunities. And this is an example or an illustration from Tony D'Amato and Paul Catanzaro, Restoring Old Growth Characteristics to New England and New York's Forests. That illustrates that you can have active management for saw timber, which has some minor elements to support that structural diversity, and that can be really valuable. On the other side of the active gradient, it may be active management that is leaving a huge volume or large percentage for in perpetuity for the rest of their natural life. And some of that is going to have economic trade-offs. And then there's passive management as well. And landowners can pursue some of this is really exclusive to reserve forest land. Let's say the left two options are probably exclusive to reserve forest land, while the other three are probably available for the productive forest land categories as well.
Gentlemen.
Back to that slide,
Sure.
please. I've been waiting very patiently to talk about this. So there's an instruction here. The top point here would suggest that the more passive the management style, the more carbon storage that we achieve. But I disagree with this actually, because I see the forest biome as a volatile structure that, trees fall, trees burn, they re-release a lot of these gases as methane, as carbon. Whereas in a more actively managed forest, the removed lumber may actually be locked in a home or structure for maybe centuries, in furniture. The regular thinning of the forest also helps the longevity of the trees from falling over. You were giving an example of, I'm not saying you're the author of this, but this assumption is so common that we're in a place now where the general population believes that if we just leave it alone, it'll be better.
Yeah.
Whereas I'm kind of advocating for a sweet spot. What do you think about that?
I love it.
All right.
And I love it because, so this needs like 3 more axes.
Yeah, yeah.
I think notably, it doesn't have time on it. So in a given moment, passive management will keep more carbon on site.
Right.
50 years from now, will it end up with more carbon ultimately stored? It really depends. Where is that wood going? What was harvested at the time? And so I think that this is an incredibly useful illustration, particularly about the range of management options to really be inclusive, that there are options to actively manage or passively management and everywhere in between to support these goals. And generally speaking, in the moment, the more passive the management is, the more carbon that will be left on site. Whether or not we are maximizing or optimizing carbon storage in the long term, I think importantly, whether we're maximizing or realizing resilience on that site, these are other variables that need to be considered as we're looking at old forest passive or active management.
Do you feel that those viewpoints are being discussed and thought about and put into planning in the broader forestry world of Vermont?
Yes.
Okay.
And we need more.
Yeah.
I think there is a really persuasive and maybe at its simplest logical perception that we've got a carbon problem. And if we cut our trees, then we're compounding that carbon problem.
That's not necessarily true, though.
It's not necessarily true, but it resonates.
Yeah.
And so it's against that really simple understanding or perception that we need to have kind of nuanced and long conversations about some of these other variables and how we balance one strategy with another. And so,
Thank you.
yeah. So here's where we're at so far. This enrollment category allows about, and this is estimated, about 4,000 parcels might be eligible total. This is between currently enrolled and potentially eligible. So it's about 700,000 acres that could potentially be eligible. And prior to April 1, we had 14 parcels that had submitted plans for enrollment in reserve forest land, totaling 1,100 and almost 1,200 acres. So it's not nothing. This isn't approaching the really significant contribution of old forest. But we also wouldn't expect to see that right now. There's a learning curve. Landowners need to become aware of it. Consultants need to become aware of it, and they need to be comfortable preparing the plans and offering the service to landowners.
Representative Rice.
I was just wondering about that point earlier, so thought might be a good opportunity to ask just sort of what is the forester community, sort of what's the education or conversation going on to make sure that foresters are sort of getting up to speed with being comfortable preparing.
So we did a lot of meetings and a lot of trainings related to this. There are some webinars on, and I'll share a link to our webpage about this. And so there are a lot of foresters who are bought into it. Many of them have already been doing some version of this in their management planning. Some are taking it on new. There are some wonky PBR detail elements that we need to nail down for mapping, and those details can be frustrating and add costs to the landowner and forester. So I think that cost will go down over time. we have a lot of foresters who were against this enrollment category, who are coming up to me and saying, I've got the perfect property. And they're excited about what they can do as a forester to support this goal, to support those landowner goals, and kind of affirm that this is a good fit in many cases. So, but it's still going to be a learning curve. For sure.
Representative Lipsky?
Yeah, is there an economic, with a managed UVA parcel, there's often revenue coming from stock sales, which is a positive for keeping the parcel intact, enrolled and forested. Is there a economic incentive by a lower valuation for these reserve categories where a parcel owner may lose complete, if it's the whole parcel's included, reduced or very little revenue from stumpage sales? Is there any other incentives like this land is valued in additionally reduced value?
So you're
I'm
asking,
not advocating for that.
right, you're asking what's the use value and does enrollment in this category result in a preferential use value?
Yeah. Or
that would might incentivize. This was a discussion, so for context, the use value is established in part by stumpage that's generated through harvesting. And that is applied to all forest land enrollments. And our thinking on this is we could, or the state could choose to have a use value that's associated with the revenue potential of this enrollment, which is lower generally than land managed for saw timber. That would create an incentive, a financial incentive for landowners to enroll in this category that may be independent of the kind of ecological contribution or the state's goals. And conversely, adding another use value creates huge administrative costs. In addition, you can imagine that there are all sorts of other variations in terms of revenue potential from a given piece of land. If you have land that's super rocky and can barely grow trees, but it's enrolled, that revenue potential is going to be very different than a fully stocked white pine plantation. But we don't create different use values based on those differences. For administrative reasons and consistency, we apply one use value, and that makes it a lot easier. In the past, there had been, I think, 9 use values based on soil productivity and so on, and they abandoned it. It was too much. And so right now there's not an incentive, and we're really trying to look at the purposes, the opportunities on the ground as the basis for enrollment, as opposed to creating a financial favoritism for one category or another. Sure thing. This is, I will add one piece. The opportunity for some landowners who are enrolling in this category to engage in carbon markets may be greater in some cases than for other landowners. If they can not actively manage their land, then they may be eligible for certain opportunities in the Family Forest Carbon Program or others that they wouldn't have access to in the productive forest land category. Those revenue potentials we're too early to really calculate any of that stuff. But it's something that we're keeping an eye on.
Representative O'Brien?
Are parcels like the Cold Hollow to Canada enrolled in current use or are not for profits? They don't even have to pay property tax, for example.
Yeah, so those Cold Hollow to Canada parcels are not owned by Cold Hollow to Canada. Those are private parcels that are being supported by the Cold Hollow to Canada organization. And so those are private land parcels. Many of them, I don't know. I know many of them are enrolled in Use Valley. Not-for-profits that own land for conservation purposes, many of them do enroll in the conservation category of use value. And so those lands can be managed. There are some different standards, both for plans and management requirements, given that their nonprofit status is based on conservation. They've got kind of some additional responsibilities to manage for conservation outcomes.
And Temple.
You were just mentioning carbon markets. Is the Vermont state government involved in any sort of regulation or program regarding this? Is there, no.
We are not. We are engaged in conversations with folks who are managing these. For instance, with the Family Forest Carbon Program, their standards came out.
What is that?
The Family Forest Carbon Program is a program for small landowners. It's a 20-year agreement, and there are two possible enrollment categories. One is basically allows for some management, but it's a reduced harvesting rate than kind of the average. And the other is a grow older forest enrollment option, where they're basically not harvesting. And if landowners can receive $200 or $300 per acre for that 20-year period, depending on the number of enrollment category that they're participating in. That's the only kind of cookie cutter program that's out there. There are also voluntary and regulatory carbon markets that require kind of a more complete individualized property assessment, working with a broker of those credits. It's much more involved. We don't have as much engagement with those partners, though there have been some reports written for the legislature a couple of years ago. There was one. Things have changed a lot since then, but when we were speaking earlier, Ali Kasiba with UVM Extension has really been a leader in the region, considering and getting information out about carbon markets. And so I think if there are more questions about that, she'd be a great person to talk to.
So given our prior conversation about, snapshots versus what happens over the long term, do you think that these, the Family
Forest Carbon,
do you think that's actually achieving its goals?
I don't know.
Yeah. It's a good answer.
I think it's worth, I think all of these are worth looking at closely.
Yeah.
And if they are successful and they are complementary to our other goals, that's awesome.
Yeah.
If they aren't successful or they create tension with our other goals, then thinking about how we do it well. The idea that landowners can generate revenue from healthy forests is exciting. To the extent that it has a bunch of trade-offs, I think we need to navigate those and consider it thoughtful.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
One of the really important messages we're sending to a lot of landowners is that though most parcels are not eligible for this enrollment category, the management objective of advancing old forest characteristics is not exclusive to this category. And in fact, there are a lot of opportunities in productive forest management to really accelerate old forest characteristics and achieve those characteristics and those values sooner than you would otherwise, on the order of decades. And here's an illustration of that. On the top, and again, this is from the Restoring Old Growth Characteristics. On the top is a timeline, passive pathways to old forest, and the 90 to 110-year-old part of that timeline is where most of our forests are. And then around year 200 is generally where the large tree benchmark conditions are going to be reached in many of our forests. And this is going to vary forest to forest and so on. So this is a strong generality, but I think it's still worthwhile. Looking at the illustration below, using an active pathway to old forests, where individual trees are released from competition, allowed to access sunlight, they can grow faster. In the process, you can sell some of that wood to generate revenue and pay for that work. You can leave some of that wood to support the forest wooded material accrual. This is a really valid option that often is not as strongly considered in advancing old forest characteristics by some, but a really valid one that we need to keep on the table. And
Great slide.
what's that?
Great slide.
It is a great slide, and I think that looking at this, we can often look at this is narrowly looking at a restoration strategy, but it doesn't need to be that either. This could be forest management for saw timber that includes elements of this, and that is developing these old forest characteristics. So these tools, these strategies really shouldn't be viewed as exclusive to restoration or old forest characteristics. They can be, and increasingly are, and have been, just part of how we take care of our forests. Some foresters or public lands management have been applying a lot of this stuff for a long time. We're articulating it better than we have in the past, but it's been part of the mix. Got two more slides, and I'll just breeze through this. There's a link where you can find all these resources. And I think I just want to close with this, that when we're balancing objectives and strategies for our forests, this goes back to that comment about if we've got old forest targets, we need to also be thinking about our young forest targets. We also need to be thinking, I mean, that's just a very small percentage of the state in those two conditions. Our sustainably managed forest is the bulk of our forest land. We also have goals for resilience, biodiversity, water, carbon, a vibrant economy, local renewable forest products, jobs. All these things need to be balanced as we are advancing any individual goal. And we may be wildly successful in managing wildlands or wildly successful in advancing young forests or one or the other, but we are going to fail in our broad goals if we are narrowly focused on any one. We need to be able to say yes to all of them and figure out where that balance exists. In the legislative process for the reserve forest land category, originally it was proposed that the percentage threshold be 30% across the board. And during that discussion, the legislature ultimately decided that too many parcels and too many acres were going to become eligible for us to be confident about that balance. There was a perceived risk. And at that time, they chose to increase the threshold for parcels less than 100 acres from 30% to 50%. And that basically cut in half the eligible parcels. That concerned many. It relieved many. And in addition, as part of this report, there was a requirement that part of Act 146, a report evaluating the utilization and impacts of the new subcategory is due in 2026, basically giving 3 years for these rounds of updates to figure out what's the uptake rate, what's the trade-off with working lands, are we achieving our old forest goals, so on. And all of that is going to take time to understand. So there were some measures put in place at that time to really tend to that balance, both to provide opportunities to expand this or to recognize if it's not meeting its old forest goals, to potentially, or at least consider if it's appropriate to push it forward, or if it's removing too many opportunities for sustainable forest management, that's also a risk. And we want to be aware of it and respond appropriately at that time. And so I think that's important context, is considering other proposals that may come forward, that there have been some safety measures put in place to ensure that the multiple goals that we're looking to achieve are being achieved in balance with each other. That's all I've got.
Thank you.
Great. Commissioner Fitzko, you have your hand
Well,
up.
I just wanted to see if he would be willing to share a little bit about a US Forest Service grant that he wrote. That
Yes.
should be coming and exciting work that he's leading for Vermont.
Sure. Actually, I have a meeting later today. The Inflation Reduction Act had about $150 million available for both states and nonprofits to engage landowners in private markets for forest resilience. And originally, for many, this was expanding carbon market opportunities and others, which really wasn't our focus. Our approach for this was engaging landowners in forest products markets for forest resilience, with the intent of really connecting the management on the ground and the public's understanding of the role of active management in advancing forest resilience goals. It's happening a lot. I think it could be happening more. And so we've got $5 million. It was the 6th largest grant in the country for this. And it's going to include establishing a resilience standard, helping to communicate what this is with UVM extension, helping to advance a broader understanding. What are we talking about? Because a lot of these conversations about resilience can be kind of theoretical or hard to put our finger on. Going to try to ground some of this stuff. We're going to have $1 million for resilience plans for landowners. We're going to have contract riders, about $650,000 to pay to loggers who are implementing resilience practices in the course of timber sales. So there's an existing harvest in play, loggers going out to do that. There might be some add-ons that help support, broaden the margins for them that both advance resilience goals while making their job more viable. We're going to be doing trainings for foresters and loggers around all this stuff, and doing a lot of outreach with it. And so that's going to be over the course of the next 5 years.
VPR, thank you, was the recipient of this grant?
FPR.
FPR.
Yes.
Yeah, right.
They laugh at me too, Tim.
FPR was the recipient of the grant. There will be a lot of partners who are also subrecipients. The majority of the money is not coming to FPR. The majority of the money is going to be going to partners who are going to help deliver this, with nearly $2 million going to foresters and loggers who are supporting management for forest products that advance resilience goals on private lands. So landowners will also be major beneficiaries of this.
Sounds like, there were several bills that came and failed to try to get some resilience support for the broad industry, the harvesting industry. So this sounds like a rebirth of potential.
I just want to say we did get $1 million into the budget.
Yes.
So,
That's exciting.
yes.
We did, has that been voted in yet?
I
Or
think it's still in the Senate.
Okay.
Yes.
Some of us didn't share that it passed the House though, so.
I have a quick question. Keith, I'm just wondering, going back several slides, when you noted that most parcels won't be eligible, but that you could still manage for the characteristics even with, even so. And I'm wondering how that message has been received if you are running into.
Some folks are really excited by it. And I think there is a lot of embedded and perceptions that take time to kind of let go of the thinking about what is forest management. There are many who believe it is timber extraction. And I think there are very, very few people who are involved in forest management who believe that's the case, but many landowners do. And so we've got a job to do to help listen to them, understand their concerns, understand what they're excited about on their property, and help see and envision an opportunity that that can help them realize their goals while accessing enrollment in the current use program and managing for saw timber. And in many cases, that management for forest products enables that in ways that very few, if any, other strategies would allow.
Thank you for coming in and providing an update. Thank you for staying with us a little bit later than we had asked you to. And I guess the official report to the legislature isn't due for another couple of years.
That one.
But if you're here next year, those of us who are here next year, we might want to hear just another update on the numbers and any additional thoughts.
There is a report due from Property Valuation Review in January of next year about the appropriateness of the different use values. So pointing to your question that there was a question of whether or not the forest land value is appropriate for reserve forest land. And so there will be some discussion about that in a report due then.
Whether that dollar amount is the right dollar amount.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.